Hi, Crystal.
Hi.
I'm coming back in a few minutes. You can, I know they tell us to be here early, but just do whatever you need to do.
Okay, but I was told you're not moderating Bandile is.
I've been put back on the moderating.
Okay, and then the other panelist is not able to join, right?
There were three, there are now two.
Okay, all right, because I was a bit, okay, cool.
But I'll be back in 3 minutes.
Okay.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Thanks. Good evening, everyone. We're just going to wait another 2 minutes and kick off after that. Excellent. Thank you. Good evening again, everyone. I'm just going to give another minute before we get going. Thanks very much. All right, good evening, everyone, and thanks very much. This is the last session of the REFA Festival. My name is Gillard Isaacs. I'm the director of the Institute, one of the hosts of the festival, and really great to see both our panelists and those in attendance. We've been really fortunate in the sessions to have a wide range of simultaneous sessions, and therefore to be able to have smallish groups with which we can have conversations. So we really are hoping that the attendees and our panelists will be able to engage each other in a dynamic way. We've had a few people do so, but if you're able to just introduce yourself in the chat, just remember to make sure that you click that everyone can see, not just the hosts and panelists, so that you are writing to everyone, and just introduce yourself and maybe say where you're from, either institutionally or where you're located geographically. We have two fantastic speakers for this session, and I'm going to introduce it and pose some broad questions and then hand over to them. Each of them will have about 15 minutes. I will indicate when it's about 3 minutes left, and then we'll have a chance for engagement between all of us here. Great. So the theme here is about the role of the state and how the types of economic policy responses which we've seen in response to COVID-19, what those mean and what those indicate. Okay, and I think what we've seen is interesting and at times contradictory responses, which also have specific features in Africa, which might vary from elsewhere. But on a global level, there's no doubt what we've seen is that the state has really intervened in a significant way, both obviously in terms of public health, lockdowns, and so on, but also in economic terms, in terms of the various labor market policies, in terms of social support, large fiscal and monetary interventions. At the same time, the contradictory element, which I know some of our panelists will speak to, is that the follow-up, the conditions to some of the loans and elements like that might be an imposition of a withdrawal of some of those social relief measures and other response measures. So what we're really interested in here is in the context of the kind of neoliberal period, this last 30, 40 years, where states played a kind of market-centric role, and where we saw states under COVID really play a very interventionist role. What does this indicate? How do we understand these dynamics, and how do we make sense of those locally and continentally? The speakers are going to have their own opportunity to respond in ways which resonate with them and their own work. Crystal Simeoni is going to go first, and Crystal, I'm posing both this broad question to you of the shifting role of the state, but also in relationship to your work as a feminist scholar and activist, reflections on the uneven nature of that, and what a gendered and a feminist analysis of that looks like. Before I hand over to you, just to introduce Crystal as a Pan-African feminist activist working on macro level economic issues. She serves as the director of NAWI, the AfriFem Macroeconomic Collective. She curates the work of the collective towards contributing to the building of a feminist community in Africa of both individuals and organizations, which work towards influencing, analyzing, deconstructing, and reconstructing macroeconomic policies and narratives. The work of the collective, using an intersectional Pan-African feminist lens, reimagines what the alternatives might look like. Crystal previously worked at Femnet and at Tax Justice Network Africa, and is currently an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity. And I'm very proud to say Crystal is also a friend of the Institute and it is great having you.
Thanks, Gilad, and hello, everyone. My name is Crystal, like Gilad says. I'm based in Nairobi. I'm at a hotel at a strategic meeting, so I don't have control over my lights, and so it's like dimming and like playing like ghost themes. So I apologize in advance for
That's
that.
okay.
So I'm sitting at an awkward position. I usually have like a nice painting behind me, but I guess it matters what I say rather than what you see. So yeah, the work of Nawi is Pan-African Feminist, which you can imagine is two very distinct fights, all rolled into one. It's an anti-patriarchal fight from a feminist perspective, but it's also a Pan-African one against a neoliberal, neo-colonial attack on the continent. And so balancing those two can sometimes be pretty heavy. So here we are. We work regionally across the continent and engage in regional processes as well as global processes from that Pan-African feminist lens. The reason we work on the economy and specifically development finance and macro level economic policies is because a lot of the time on the continent, if you talk about women and the economy, it will be at a micro level. It would be microfinance, financial inclusion, all those things that look at livelihood projects of individuals and these issues that have long-lasting effects and impact on the quality of life. You could have a 50 chicken project, but a woman still has to take her children to has to access universal health care. And so these are the things that we really put at the center of analysis, and put at the center of analysis is power. And that's a feminist lens of engagement. So when Gilad asked me the two questions, and I'm wondering, Gilad, do I answer the two questions in one session, or are you going to ask, do you want me to break it up into two?
No, I think answer them
Okay.
as feels right, like for you. But
okay, great. So I'll take them both in the 10, 15 minutes that I have. And I think, the things stay the same, and it feels like sometimes it feels like we're in this warped deja vu cycle that we're repeating and not from history. And so take us back to the times of slavery, and a neocolonial, neoliberal system really has to have something that subsidizes it. From the slavery days, it was free labor that really injected what was needed for an industrial revolution in the global north. It was to the tune of $60 trillion of free labor produced and something like this, right? And then we went into the colonial period, and we all know how that went. And this debt, Sankara is known to have made his famous speech at the AU saying, if we try and pay back our debt, for sure, we will die. If we don't pay back our debt, our creditors, nothing happens to them really. He died a little bit of a time after that, and you can draw conclusions as to his death. But then came the structural adjustment programs of the 80s and 90s, where we were instructed on how to reimagine our economy so that we can pay this debt. And that really was a shrinkage of the state, pulling back on resources and really changing and shifting the social contract between state and citizens. And now, it continues to have devastated a public sector where universal access was no longer there to healthcare, to education, to water, to housing, to infrastructure. Private percentage of our population is young and don't have a living knowledge or intimate understanding of what the central role of a state is. And so this idea and this narrative, and narratives are very strong in the work that we do, that private is always better, and decimating the role of the state. The idea that private state is incapable of providing.
Crystal, sorry to interrupt. It was breaking up slightly there. Maybe turn your camera off as much as we would prefer not. And let's just see if that's clearer. Sorry about that.
That's fine. Thank you for flagging that. And please stop me if I'm going too fast as well. So we fast forward to present day, and COVID happens, and to the fore, all these problems have been underlying. COVID didn't create any of these inequalities. Not only did it not create people that have been working in the activist spaces, in the development finance space, in the economic justice space, we all were privy to the Africa is Rising narrative, where we were on the front pages of journals, of magazines, of newspapers. But as much as our GDP and this notion that our economies were on the rise, so was our inequality. Our inequality actually deepened and was on the rise in tandem with our economic growth. So economic growth and the question of what that means, I think, has to be central to our thinking. And then comes COVID, right? Like I said, nobody expected it. We are now being told that we need to build back better, and the feminists have been pushing back on that idea of what building back better was, when, and I've said this before, so apologies for repeating it, how do we build back when what was built was never for us, only from us? This idea that we must constantly be subsidizing a global economy, where across the global south, the global south contributes over 65% of raw materials, over 65% of labor. Very deep story of inequality at a global level. At a human level, the economic impacts are being felt of COVID in various ways. The predominance of the informal sector across the continent has led to increased economic precarity as markets have closed in response to the pandemic. And we all know that women dominate the informal sector on the continent. And with evidence that globalization has increased women then decreased it, resulting in its increased gender.
Crystal, I've lost you there a bit. I don't know if Bhaso, Badile,
am I there?
Yeah, Gilad, she is cutting off on my side as well.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's fine, Crystal. I wonder whether you want to, we have been able to hear up until now, but I wonder whether you want to sort of shift around and see if you can get a better signal. If that's not possible nearby where you are, we can ask Bhaso to also come in on some elements and return to you after that. Okay.
Is this okay? Can you hear me?
We can, but not well. Crystal,
okay. So you can move to Bhaso while I try and figure out what to do.
Okay. Excellent. But that, I think Crystal's given a great historical and theoretical introduction for us in terms of how we start to think about the sort of economic interventions by states, in particular in Africa. Bhaso Ndzendze is a senior lecturer and the head of department in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. His current research focus is on the relationship between African countries and China, in particular in comparison with Taiwan, since the early 2000s. He has published widely in journals and in books, and he is currently working on manuscripts on artificial intelligence and international relation theories, and in theorizing East Africa's interstate wars from in theorizing East Africa's interstate war. He's also written popular articles, including in the Daily Maverick, the Independent, and the Mail and Guardian. Excellent, Bhaso. I'm going to hand over to yourself. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Gilad, and thank you to the organizers for the kind invitation to be part of this festival. So as you've heard, my areas are a bit removed from Crystal, which is why I hope she comes back and is able to complete her talk. I'm taking quite a lot of notes. My particular focus area is, at least for today especially, is around, as Gilad said, the trilateral relationship between China and Taiwan, or the two Chinas, as some would put it, and African countries. And one particular question which drives my research in this regard is why countries in Africa seem to have chosen China, especially since the year 2000, whereas before in the 20th century, they used to go back and forth, right? They used to, on the one hand, recognize Taiwan, and 5 years later recognize China, and back and forth, and so on. And this is a question that has been around for quite some time, and for many scholars and common sense, frankly, people with common sense, the answer would seem to lie in economics, right? These countries recognize the economic opportunity presented by China, and so switch. But that is an assumption that has gone on without proof. And I've sought to close that gap by presenting some research that will at least explicate or determine for us why at particular moments. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then look towards the continent's future relationships in the wake of COVID, what that might mean for the Africa-China relationship, what that might mean for Africa's development as a result, and what that might mean in a geopolitically intensifying global context, right? You've got the US and China's trade war, you've got the EU, you've got China taking a much more aggressive stance towards Taiwan and its territorial disputes. And so I think this is a particular area of fascination for me in the context of today's topic, because this is one of those areas where the state is always present, right? Especially because you have to choose between either Taiwan or China. That is the condition insisted upon mainly by Beijing, not so much by the government of Taiwan based in Taipei. So this seems to be one of those things where state-led development is an inevitability, right? This is one of those areas where a state's sort of high-level decision on which China to recognize has a direct impact on the country's ability to attract aid, to attract foreign direct investment, and to attract and politically enhanced trade relations with China. Of course, ever since China entered the World Trade Organization, it has carried out some reforms, but at the same time, it still remains the case that things like free trade agreements, things like import credits or export credits are determined by the government. China also makes use of policy banks, or what are called policy banks, which is something that is quite unique to China. So if you are an African country hoping to grow, and I think many countries are, then you need to choose strategically and apply a bit of rational choice theory as to which one you choose. So I'm going to share very briefly some interesting findings in this regard, and then talk a bit about future prospects as I see them. So just for reference, I know this is a group of people who are very wealthy, so they would know that this is Taiwan, commonly known, or to itself known as the Republic of China. And then this is China, the People's Republic of China. These two entities have been at odds with each other since 1949. The people who run Taiwan claim to be the sole representative of China, but have begun to be much less insistent on that since 1971. And the people who are in mainland China say that this island is nothing but a renegade province of China. And this began really, if you want to be technical, in 1912 with the Republic of China being declared. And over time, the Communist Party rising out of China and chasing out the people who ran the Republic of China, the nationalists, and declaring their own People's Republic of China after the Second World War and the Chinese Civil War that followed in its wake. So history casts a long shadow. And as I said, 1971 was quite an important point because that is when China enters the United Nations, replacing Taiwan. And a substantial portion of those votes, I think 25 out of 70 votes, came from African countries that in the United Nations General Assembly kicked out Taiwan. But however, my focus is from the year 2000 to the current period, because as I said, this era is unique in that there is no back and forth switching, that basically all African countries, with the exception of one, which is the Kingdom of Eswatini, and we'll talk a bit about that, have all migrated essentially in their diplomatic relations towards China. And a bit of a clue into this is in this graph, because China's economy is much bigger than Taiwan's, but that is just an obvious fact. But what would make China much more attractive is that even though it's bigger, it's also more competitive. It's much more attractive to African countries. It presents opportunities to African countries. So it's big and also growing. Taiwan in the past number of years in the World Economic Forum index has surpassed China only in 2 years, relatively speaking. But of course, in absolute terms, we know China has a GDP right now of about 14 trillion, whereas Taiwan's is about 500 billion. So there's quite a huge gap there for African countries. So we'd expect them to switch towards China, and switch they have. But one of the questions which has not been addressed, at least until this paper, which I published last year, was why at those particular moments, why, because as many of us will know, the obvious economic decisions are not always the ones which are made, right? So why did these governments choose the particular years in which they switched? Many of them switched around 2000, 2001, 2005, 2008, and then no country switched until 2015, and then 17 and 18. So the question is why those moments? And this is something which has not been fully addressed until pretty much this paper. And as I say, in fact, this question of policy, right, has spawned entire shelves of libraries around particular policy moments. So why do African countries choose these particular moments in which to switch towards China and leave Taiwan, as it were? So my argument is that this is linked to democracy, right? All African countries which have become democracies since the year 2000, inevitably, all of them, 100%, have gone on to recognize China over Taiwan. And this is contrary to some of what was expected if you look at the early literature towards the end of the Cold War and in the early post-Cold War period. The thinking was that these countries are going to, and a bit influenced by the work of Francis Fukuyama, that these African countries, as they democratize, they will have more identity similarity towards Taiwan, and so we can expect China to lose a number of allies But actually what they did not take account of was the mechanism of democracy and competitive electoral politics. And so the argument I make, and the data backs up this argument, as far as I'm concerned, is that the presence of competitive elections in these countries, either the introduction of or bad performance in prior elections by incumbent governments, forces them to think economically, and in so doing to say, what are our economic options? What is at our disposal? And inevitably, one of the key points that shows up is, why are we still recognizing Taiwan when at the moment, and this is my point, at the moment, things can change. Taiwan's economy, all other things being equal, could pick up the next day and leave China's economy in the dust. And I argue that that would soon see African countries recognize Taiwan once again. So one of the things that inevitably comes up is, why are we still recognizing Taiwan instead of China, when China has so much more to offer? And if we don't act accordingly, if we don't do what is economically beneficial, at least marginally, when you compare Taiwan and China, China has much to offer marginally. Then we will be punished in the ballot box. And here's the thing: you can choose to not recognize China, but China's products are going to get into your market either way. But if you choose to recognize China, you at least have an opportunity to close that balance of trade deficit that you have, because in a sense you are putting yourself out of the discussion when you don't have a diplomatic relationship with China. You can then, once you have this diplomatic relationship, be able to negotiate, be able to get, as the Gambia did, a free trade agreement, or be able to get infrastructure that will enable your market. So we see here in the cases of Senegal, in the case of Chad, that soon after a bad electoral turnout by the incumbent, the countries soon switched towards China and left Taiwan behind. Similarly, in the case of Malawi, we see here that after performing very badly in 2004, the incumbent party, political party, then switched to Taiwan. To China, left Taiwan. And the question is, did it pay off? And it certainly did, because if you look at this data, which I pulled from the United Nations trade map, the exports instantly pick up, Malawian exports to China, because political mechanisms are put into place, policy mechanisms are put into place to make it easier for this country to export to China. Similarly, in the case of Burkina Faso, soon after recognizing China in the year 2018, you see a huge growth, many times, manifold growth in exports to China, especially compared to those to Taiwan. So as to what we can expect going forward, I think at the same time, I'm mindful that this relationship is not the only sort of competitive relationship that African countries have, and which African governments have. And at the center of this is the question of economic diplomacy. But at the same time, I don't expect much to change, actually, in terms of, so I think China has been able to at least win the moment, to grab the imagination, as it were. Many countries were impressed, especially on the continent, with what China was able to do in its COVID response. And so there has been this huge return of the state. A colleague of mine here in the department, Professor Zondi, wrote an excellent article on this, around the return of the state and the doing away, the chipping away of the concept of the lean and mean state of the 1980s. And because the pandemic has shown that things like structural adjustment policies can have a very negative effect on health, which, as we know now, especially, cannot just be a national health problem, but it quickly becomes a global health crisis. So there has been then this momentary return of China. Even when I look at the data, trade data especially, the relationship actually between China and Africa had been declining somewhat since 2014, because 2014, the imports and exports between the two entities peak, but they start to climb down quite a bit in the subsequent years which follow. And we all know 2016 was also quite a terrible year for trade globally. But at the same time, if we look at what's been happening with, for example, South Africa's trade with the United States, even under President Trump, even under Donald Trump, you see that actually South Africa's exports to the US have been growing even last year during the onset of COVID. If you compare this month to month, the black charts are 2019 and the gray ones are 2020. Consistently, the most recent year, 2020, outperforms the trade seen in 2019. And this is on a long-term basis, actually quite a turnaround, because if you look at what was happening in South African trade with the US in the last 4 years, particularly of the Obama administration, it's all negative. In terms of year-on-year growth in trade. But actually, in the entire 4-year period of President Trump, the trade has been growing quite considerably between South Africa and the US. Now, this is my final slide. Now, given the geopolitics I've mentioned, and at the center of this, and I think most captivatingly, has been the US-China trade war. The question then is, what have African countries been doing? I've been hoping that they would take advantage and turn crisis into opportunity. And the same goes for COVID. Because if you look at this graph, well, one of the things which has happened as a result of the trade war is that there have been reciprocal tariffs imposed on US agricultural products in particular by China, opening up a huge gap for African countries potentially, and really any other region, to close that gap by feeding this very large and very hungry Chinese market. But so far, I have to say, it's been quite disappointing when you look at the trends, because other regions, especially Asia, have been able to increase their agricultural exports to China. But at the same time, Africa's agricultural exports to China have been declining. And in fact, another graph, which I don't have here, shows that basically Africa has been importing more US agricultural products as they are being diverted away from the US, sorry, from the Chinese market. So it would seem to me then that there has been a return of the state, and that Africa has learned or picked up, at least on a rhetorical basis, from the Chinese example, but it has not applied that state-led development approach towards China itself. And I think that is the greatest area of opportunity that could be taken advantage of. So thank you very much, Gilad, for the opportunity to share some of these findings, and I look forward to the discussion.
Awesome, thanks so much, Bhaso. And I think what's I'll return us to after Crystal's input, but what really comes up here is that the decisions being made by states globally, especially by those who are large powers, and the choices which we make here in terms of which of those we interact with have profound impacts on the developmental opportunities which African governments face. And I'll return to some of those themes. Crystal, to invite you back online.
Thanks, Gilad. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Great. I just moved to my phone. It seems to have better internet than the entire hotel. So I'll carry on from where I left off and probably just repeat a little bit because I know I broke off. And I was speaking about COVID, and at a human level, the economic impacts have been felt in such various ways. The predominance of the informal sector across the continent has led to increased economic precarity as markets have closed in response to the pandemic, and women specifically dominate the informal sector on the continent, as we know, with evidence that globalization has increased women's employment informality rather than decreased it, and that it results in increasing gendered income disparity. But COVID has also intensified gendered economic inequalities significantly. And based in South Africa, you would know this, for example, that rural women who are subsistence farmers and informal traders have experienced such severe loss of income and have found themselves relying on loan sharks to sustain their production and households. In Kenya, loan sharks have taken forms of, like in the fintech space, taking advantage of the Silicon Savannah, as Kenya is now being called. But in Kenya and Ghana, a study of young women in urban areas who are mostly workers in the informal sector showed significant decreases in income and loss of jobs since the onset of the pandemic. But even women in formal paid employment are being disproportionately hit, with industries that employ more women being most impacted by the global fallout of 2020 and currently 2021. The gendered segregation of work that exists across many industries, coupled with unfair working contracts, pay, and conditions, leave women doubly vulnerable in any economic crisis, and COVID has been no different. But several countries also took employment retention measures and set up worker compensation funds, for example. And when it comes to taxation measures, Kenya, where I live, introduced 100% tax relief on monthly income of $240 or less. The top income tax rate was also reduced from 30 to 25%, and VAT shrunk from 16 to 14%. Corporation tax reduced by 5%. However, these measures were short-lived, with Kenya's parliament reversing all but one of them in December of last year, only 8 months after they were introduced. But also on top of that, considering that a large number of women exist in the informal economy, a tax relief on monthly income really doesn't have any sort of positive impact on their lives and their ability to navigate through the pandemic. At 57%, the measures focused on preventing and responding to violence forms the majority of gender-sensitive measures taken on the continent. And these have really ranged from setting up or boosting hotlines, shelters, and other GBV services, Mozambique, Angola, South Sudan, and others, to fast-track cases in court, and measures to improve data collection, like in Cameroon. Despite WHO advice for governments to declare GBV services essential and an integral part of national and local COVID response plans, by September 2020, only 7 countries, so these were Cote d'Ivoire, the DRC, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, Uganda, and Zimbabwe in the region, had taken this step. And this really speaks to the role of the state in making sure that gender policies actually make a difference. But many of the COVID response and recovery-related actions taken by IFIs and the development community really fall short on addressing gender inequalities as well. And so, for example, just 8 out of 71 World Bank Health Emergency Response projects approved between April and the end of June last year were aiming to eliminate healthcare fees, which are prohibitive in at least 56 of those countries. And we all know that out-of-pocket healthcare expenses hit the poor and women the hardest, and prior to the pandemic pushed 100 million people into poverty every year. And so this, this idea that, the past keeps repeating itself and getting better at being extractive and being oppressive remains a constant. But the Pan-African feminist movement has a couple of propositions, and I won't go through all of them, but I'll go through maybe 2. And so on care and unpaid labor, we really feel that countries need to develop a system-wide approach to the care economy by investing in care infrastructure and really broadening out the definition of what that care economy looks like and includes, to move it into a very African definition of the term, rather than just follow a global narrative that may not entirely resonate with us. It needs to be inclusive, including access to water and electricity, along with care facilities that include for young and the old, and institutions in ensuring decent work conditions for all workers across the care sectors in education, with health, with child and elderly care, wider social and community services, domestic work, public transport, housing, water, as well as sanitation. And we must liberate women from these inequitable and unsustainable unpaid care work burdens and governments must ensure quality, accessible, and universal public services and universal social protection. If there's ever a lesson that's coming out of this pandemic, it is that. And then also linked to this is access to public services. I can see Gilad, your camera is on, so I'm wrapping up soon. Governments must ensure...
that's fine, Crystal.
Okay.
You have got time. Sorry about that.
Governments must ensure basic universal access to land, to water, to food, to healthcare, and must include sexual and reproductive health, transport, education, housing, electricity, and information technology. And crucially, you must really include essential services to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. This will require reclaiming and protecting the fiscal space needed for budgetary investments in social protections, including quality and accessible services for all populations. And by all, we mean everybody, regardless of how they identify, religion, sexual orientation. The increasing move towards public-private partnerships for delivery of essential services such as water, healthcare, and education must be reversed. Efficiency gains in this approach remain unproven and in many cases questionable with the presence of private sector compromises, access to these services in the pursuit of shareholder bottom lines. And this idea that private finance is our silver ticket, is our silver bullet to developmental targets on the continent. We're seeing this through the World Bank's framework, what they call the cascade approach, which comes into a country, and if you have a problem with, say, healthcare, they will be like, great, there's a private finance solution for you. You will need to readjust your policies and your legal framework to make you as attractive as possible to international private finance, to be able to deliver on this specific project around healthcare, let's say, and use that as an example. Once you do that, they then further push you to have your government act as a de-risking, take a de-risking role. The argument around this is African governments or investing in African countries is very risky, and to be as attractive as possible, your governments need to de-risk this investment, meaning that you must assure them of their bottom lines for their shareholders, but also for their profit margins as well. What this means ostensibly is that burden is then placed on citizens, an increase in taxation to ensure that private finance, which is usually global, will meet their profit targets. If you overlay that with the conversation around illicit financial flows, and many of these will be multinationals in this public-private partnership dynamic, there's an added complexity of illicit finance that's leaving the continent. But also the question of priority and who sets priority. And if maternal care, for example, is no longer profitable, it's off the table for investment. And in its stead, we are tending to, as many African countries have seen, we tending to invest in public-private partnerships with private finance, but also with governments and a lot of Chinese projects as well, in mega infrastructure projects that have very little to do with making a positive impact on citizen lives. So Kenya, for example, a few years back, invested with the Chinese government in a standard gauge rail that is costing us 7% in our GDP accruing as debt. This rail goes at a maximum speed of, I think, 130 kilometers per hour, so it's not efficient. It's not the most efficient train that we could have had. Neither is it connecting spaces and areas and regions of the country that needed connection. So its impact on smallholder trader farmers, who are largely women, 60% of Africa's food is grown by women. They are not able to access this train, but also the price limitation and the user fee means that they are not able to afford to use it. So really questioning who makes these decisions, how these decisions have come about, but also, like I mentioned before, the whole idea of private finance, public-private partnerships, really pushing this idea that the African state is incapable of providing for its citizens is one that is emerging and one that's taking root in the imagination and the hearts of a very young African population who are now striving to make sure that they can make ends meet in a private space. So making sure that they have enough money to be able to access private solutions for very, very public problems is something that we really have to think about, and how do we begin to change the narrative and really replace a social contract between state and citizen, because right now it feels like it's moving towards a contract between the state and private finance. There's a call for us to work together as African countries to make sure that we are speaking from one voice. It's the only way we can push back, but also a call to reimagine an economy that works for everyone. Reimagine an economy that centers citizens again, that centers well-being of our citizens, I think is crucial. But the hard work lies in unshackling ourselves from the safety of what we think an economy must look like, and be brave enough, audacious enough to completely put that down and really imagine something completely different that is really rooted in our histories, in our nuance, in our context, in our realities, and told by us in our own voices. I'll stop there, Gilad.
Awesome, thanks, Crystal, and really inspiring last words. I'm going to encourage comments in the chat. I'm also going to potentially, we've got time, so I'm going to do something. I will go rogue a little bit here and also allow for some verbal inputs from those in the audience, although I'm going to ask those to be kept short and on topic. But Crystal, I wanted to follow up with you on one aspect, and after that I'll ask Bhaso one thing. And Crystal, you've spoken about a different vision for what the economy should do, and you've mentioned that in a number of, in both general terms and with reference to, for instance, care economies, private finance, and so on. This runs counter, or it challenges the kinds of macroeconomic orthodoxies which we've faced, right? And as a festival that is in part grappling with economics as a field, I'm wondering, whether you see in achieving some of these objectives the need to also sort of rewrite the economic script, right? And the and our understanding of what is conventional truths and what is our understanding of the economy. And so if that's true, maybe a bit more about that, but also whether you think the COVID moment is offering that to us, right? So are we seeing a disruption of some of these economic orthodoxies, either here or elsewhere? We've got the IMF lead economist who was promoting stimulus in the sort of midst of this crisis. Are we seeing a challenge to those orthodoxies, or are we seeing their cementation, or is it differentiated across place? So yeah, to hear any thoughts which you have on that.
Well, so if you asked me this question last year, I think I was a lot more hopeful. I was talking about where, we were at a crossroads and we had the space to completely go in a completely different direction. But as the months go by, as vaccine equity is still a thing in September 2021, I'm not as hopeful as I was before. And I'm seeing definitely a cementation of very orthodox neoliberal thinking framing that's even more blatant, right? That is audacious and bolder than I've seen it. There was always this rhetoric of, we're all fighting for the same thing. But especially this year, and especially with vaccine equity as an ongoing issue, the cruelty of a neoliberal agenda, the cruelty of a global north that is extractive and continues to be extractive, has come out so strong. So I'm not as hopeful as I was. I was hopeful because for years, for so many years, feminists have been calling for a recognition of the care economy and unpaid labor. And suddenly you could hear snippets of it by policymakers. So with conversations about, like in Kenya, home-based care was a strategy for COVID, right? And that's basically because we didn't have enough hospital beds. And so there's a little bit of a strike of hope that there's the words at least being said. But again, the devil is in the details. Nobody talks about what that actually means in the workings of home-based care. Who is recognizing this work, who's doing this work, who's remunerated for this work, how do we see it as work? That conversation was completely not there. And so I question that, but at the same time, the little bit of hope that I have lies in spaces like this, in these conversations that are sparking people to ask different questions, to really question the idea that this can't be it. We do have an alternative, right? You know, Margaret Thatcher and her Tina, there is no alternative. There has to be an alternative. And I think with COVID and me being grounded in Kenya, I've had to, not had to, but I've been reading a lot more, varying pieces of information and really soaking up all sorts of knowledge. And my mother is Kikuyu, which is an ethnic group in Kenya, one of the 46. And the 5 values of the Kikuyu were honesty, generosity, justice, temperance, and courage. And this is really what they built their economy around. And I wonder if there's space for us to go back to these values, these tenets that we held true and that we, organized around. And really questioning what the economy means to us and who the economy is for. So as we talk about growth and economic growth, whose growth are we talking about and what sort of growth are we talking about? Are we talking about jobless growth? Are we talking about growth in terms of well-being of our people? What sort of growth are we talking about? So yeah, I guess that's where my hope lies, is in organizations like the IHA. There's lots of Pan-African not lots, but there's quite a number of Pan-African organizations that are addressing development finance. There's increasingly more individuals and feminists, not just feminist individuals, but feminist organizations and women's rights organizations that are questioning the power and the dynamics around macro level economics and development finance, really questioning this very neo-colonial extractive way of organizing, and then our engagement with the economy globally and what that means for us. But I think it's time for us to reclaim. And by reclaiming, I mean, we can only do it together. The African Union, the CDC has shown, like, they have been amazing through the pandemic with as little as they have, with the fights that they've had to do. They've really shown leadership and unity. As for the rest of the AU, I have very many questions, and I wonder how to inject a fresher, youthful, different way of thinking, and what this new Pan-Africanism that I can feel in the civil society. I wonder how we can inject it into the African Union, because that's our only hope. And as much as I have, questions about how they operate and what they do, I recognize that the African Union is ours, and that it's our only instrument and only framework, one of the only frameworks that we can use to push back on a global agenda that is constantly and consistently extractive of us. Yeah.
Awesome, thanks, Crystal. Bhaso, I have a question for you too, and obviously feel free to add anything. Before that, just to the audience, you're welcome to either write in the chat or raise a hand, and I'll call on you. And just adding to Crystal's comments, I think in South Africa, there was also this sort of moment of kind of hope that things are shifting, but in certain respects, I think the COVID moment has been an entrenchment of neoliberalism here in terms of the power of the macroeconomic orthodoxies, national treasury, in terms of the inefficiencies and inability of our state to really deliver and in terms of the sort of depth of the nature of the exclusiveness of the South African economy and how that's led to the state as a center of accumulation and therefore corruption. So all these trends of South African neoliberalism, I think, you also see occur under COVID here. Bhaso, I'm interested to think also about how, and if you've looked at this, how the policies of sort of global powers with whom we interact, how that filters in and influences the direction across Africa. And if you see the kind of influence of a Chinese or of a US model, and if you think there's shifts in those countries, might those shifts be felt in Africa also?
Oh, yeah, you've given me quite a lot to think through, Gilad. And I think all of this, you've said quite a number of problems that South Africa has. But I would add more, in terms of who those problems tend to impact the most. It would be young people, it would be women, it would be people in rural settings, it would be people who tend to be disproportionately Black. And I think perhaps at the heart of this is the political economy of the ANC itself, the governing party, the level of policy incoherence within the ruling party itself. I actually tend to think most of the problems that we face are not as a result of any external, at least comparatively. I think the problems emanate from within. And because the ANC inevitably will always be an incoherent policy agent, because it's a combination of so many different ideologies, if you will, different outlooks, people drawn from different worldviews. And I think that's a great way to end apartheid, by having this umbrella organization. But I think the day after the revolution, if you will, you struggle inevitably, because you are, as the ANC calls itself, a broad big tent or broad church type of political party. And so, and I mean, if you go to even where the policy thinking is supposed to be, there are just so many different people pulling in, and different, not people per se, because I think politics is more than about personalities, although leadership is important. You tend to find even the instrument which are supposed to be, and this is why I say, really, I don't worry much about foreign influence, although we should always be mindful of that, because even when there was an attempt, and there has been an attempt to sort of emulate the Chinese model by having a political party school or a Tambo school, but I think even that has not been such an impactful role player, because even its curriculum has not been coherent enough to the problems that we're facing. It hasn't even made a dent, to be honest, the Tambo school. At least perhaps it's in its early phases, but I think it'll always be stuck because of these different elements pulling, seeing to pull the party and therefore policy in different directions. The opposition parties don't give me much in the way of hope either, frankly. So I look forward to the elections, the local elections, whatever we may see there. But I think COVID has demonstrated a number of things, including the weaknesses within the opposition itself. So those are my thoughts at this point on sort of the onslaught of this neoliberal dispensation in South Africa. And I would add here just only that, the ANC had up to a certain point a huge grasp on the levers of policy from 1994 up to 2004. It could have done so much in the way of pushing up of pulling South Africa and pulling the rest of South Africa, the broader society. But there was just this continuous incoherence and endless policy articulation. People say ANC has got the best policies, just has not implemented them. I don't know how you can say that with a serious face, because how can a policy be the best policy if it has not been put into practice? But those are my thoughts, Gillett.
Really interesting. Thanks, Bhaso. To sort of link this conversation back to the international level, we see queries in the chat from Noah and in the Q&A from Bakang. And I'd like to pull these together and to hear from either panelists how we, in this moment, it appears that we agree that we need to have a break with the status quo trajectory. Okay, the question is, how does that break happen, right? And how do you deal with the international powers, which either are supportive of a break like that or seek to prevent it? So Noah asks here about the ability to pursue state-led strategies in the context of the sort of power of the IMF, World Bank, WTO, and so to both Crystal and yourself, Bhaso, whether you the emerging trends internationally, either on other states like China or in international institutions, give you hope or provide room for maneuver for African states, or whether you think what's going on the international level is closing down that room. So either of you want to come in on that?
Crystal?
Yeah.
I mean, the space that I play is regional and global at the same time, and it's very hard sometimes because you're pushing for one thing, and then our countries on the continent are doing something completely different from this fight that you're trying to fight, right? So with illicit financial flows, Africa loses a very conservative figure of $100 billion every year to illicit financial flows. Now, that like African states always told that the reason why we're not developing, one of the reasons is how corrupt we are. And yes, we are corrupt. I experience it every day, and the impact of what corruption is doing to my country. That is there. But if you look at the percentages of the illicit financial flows that leaves our continent, out of the $100 billion, only 5% is through corruption. 65% of that is through commercial activity. Commercial activity of multinational organizations who are operating in our jurisdictions on our continent, extracting a large majority of them in the extractive sector and the mining sector. But nobody talks about that. And that has to do with narratives. And it's the power and the politics of narratives. If you look at the corruption index globally, the global south will be mostly red, right? We're the ones who are most corrupt. We're red, we're in the red zone. But simultaneously, if you look at the tax haven map, which is a lot more money than the corruption amounts that we are talking about on this global map, those countries will predominantly be in the global north. And so as much as we call it, illicit financial flows, tax evasion, whatever you want to call it, really for me, it's theft. It's theft of a continent. It is what it is. And there's two conversations here, right? Because there's this idea that we can't return the money to you because there's a risk of you re-corrupting this money. And yes, there is a risk, but really it's our money. And if, there needs to be a sense of sovereignty that we can do what we need to do with our own resources and manage it, right? And there's an infantilization of the African state and of our ability to run our own affairs, which is something that I think must be spoken about in terms of a global economy and how we organize. So that's one. But then you see, attempts of appeasing a conversation. So the G7 proposition and the 12% minimum tax, global tax. And that really is not nearly enough, right? We're pushing for 15%. We're pushing for a global tax body because currently who sets global frameworks and rules on tax is the OECD, which is really a group of rich nations. African countries have no control, have no voice, have no agency, have no platform in this space. Yet we're supposed to be implementing these frameworks on equal footing, whatever that means. So the space is very undemocratic, it's very racist, it's very extractive, and we need to be pushing back on that. We've been calling for a global tax body for years. We're calling for a global tax body within the United Nations because that's the only space that we have, knowing full well that even within the United Nations, it's not an equal space and there still will be fights. But it sure as heck is much better than having it at the OECD currently, right? So I see some attempts at trying to appease, and that means that we're making progress in terms of making spaces uncomfortable. But unless we're all able to come together and push back, the G7, I think it was Kenya and I think Nigeria were the only African voices that pushed back on that, on the G7 proposal. I think if, the ideology of our leaders is really lacking. The days of Sankara, the days of Kwame Nkrumah, the likes of Nyerere, that ideology that really centered African citizens at the heart of decision-making, at the heart of policymaking, are no longer there. I'm really curious to see if anyone's going to do a mapping of how many African heads of finance ministries, heads of central bank or former World Bank, former IFC, former IMF, and you can see their policies trickling down into our national policies. And it's almost impossible to see where World Bank and IMF thinking begins and where our national thinking, especially around the economy, stops. And this confusion of what we need to be doing for our own people, I think really needs to be recentered. And again, the power of narrative, the language that we use, the notions that we push, our ability to open up conversations and ideas and really look at them from an African perspective and really look at them with the weight of our history and the weight of the impact of, a new neoliberalism that is emerging and this new wave of structural adjustment programs and the infusion, really the attack on us in all ways and the privatization of all life, right? I think that has to be central. Nobody innovates around putting on a light switch or opening up a tap of water in the global north. Yet we're supposed to be resilient enough to innovate around, accessing public services and goods, and that's not it's not sustainable. But we have to have the right ideology that is developed by us for us to be able to push back in those spaces. But I see it happening. There's more and more organizations, like I've said, and activists and individuals and thinkers that are pushing back. And that gives me some sort of hope, I guess.
Yeah. And I think that just to add on that, the interesting report that came out of Oxfam a few weeks ago, confirming, what we've seen, which is that the IMF loans are being used as a means of driving an austerity agenda. So they show, for instance, as of the middle of March, I think 85% of 107 COVID-19 loans negotiated between the IMF and 85 governments indicate plans to undertake austerity, which is cut in expenditure in order to reduce borrowing once the health crisis abates, right? So, there's an interesting, I think, inequity going on in the global responses, where on the one hand, you've got European and the US borrowing at record low interest rates, having access to funding in the US in particular, at the moment, almost a throwing out of the conventional wisdom about budgets and expenditure, and then a different standard being held for the developing world. And it's interesting because on the one hand, we can celebrate the fact that the conservative rulebook is being undermined in the advanced economies. On the other hand, its reinforcement in the developing world poses danger. I don't know really almost anything about how that's playing out in a Chinese context or in some other sort of large global South powerhouses. But Bhaso, over to you on this issue.
Sure. So thank you very much, Gilad. And I note Noah's question. I think basically there are some unique opportunities presented by the present moment. I think the global north is internally within domestic countries, the domestic politics of countries is more divided than ever. So this is not a sort of environment in which there can be immediate pushback. I think there's also been a sort of decrease in appetite for being too involved in the affairs of other countries. And I think the Afghanistan moment is particularly significant here. There's less of an interventionist impulse, while at the same time there are these domestic tribalist developments within the countries themselves. So I think a lot of the attention at the moment is internal. And at the same time, there has been a recognition as a result of COVID-19 that some level of state involvement is necessary, even by some of the most sort of conservative neoliberal societies, because, as I said, if somebody else's problem can quickly become a global phenomenon. And also with the onset of automation, there is yet another recognition of, at least in terms of discourse, and of course, changes begin as discourses, as mere ideas around some role for government. I mean, Tucker Carlson, of all people, on Fox News was even sort of swayed by the argument either for state involvement by way of pushing back against automation, if it will negatively impact on workers, and even the prospect of a universal basic income. And at the same time, I would say, let's not put our eggs in one basket, Noah, on the issue of, do we think perhaps that we could sort of lean on China and the NDB? Frankly, I'm not very much impressed by the NDB, the New Development Bank, at this point. I think it still has a long way to go, and I think it's still primarily a Chinese institution, if I'm going to be frank here, because China contributes the most, and by virtue of that has quite a bit of sway over it. And also from a game theoretical point of view, I think it's not wise to make it be known that you are going to lean on one particular partner, while at the same time, we've seen that loans from China, the interest rates have been going up quite a bit, considerably, so that pretty soon there'll be no difference. And for some countries, there already is no difference between a Chinese loan and a World Bank loan. So I think declaring that you're going to put all your eggs in one basket can come back and have quite a detrimental effect. And also I note Bakang's question around whether African countries can adapt to the Chinese model. I think that's a question that gets asked a lot. Of course, China's unique in many respects in terms of size, location, population density, and the particular historical trajectory that it's had. But at the same time, it's a country that borrowed what we now call the Chinese model, adapted it from other countries which were considerably smaller, such as South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan. And I think in all these cases, the X factor really is leadership, right? There's no two ways about it. As much as we would like these things to be sort of structural in nature, I think it begins with good leadership and then it becomes institutionalized. And to this effect, and of course, even that is debate, because I've seen works, for example, by the economist Jeffrey Sachs on how actually, if you look back at when the Chinese economic model began, his sort of points to the bottom-up origins, actually, because he says even before Deng Xiaoping said anything about we are now going to privatize communes, put an end to communes and privatize farms, people are actually doing that already by themselves because they'd already had enough of this of the system and the poverty that it was inflicting on them. And at the same time, though, I recognize the role of leadership here. And I don't think all African countries can adapt elements of the Chinese model, though I think some can and some do say that they are implicitly or explicitly, countries such as Rwanda, such as Ethiopia, through things like special economic zones. I think those are interesting. They don't always work, of course, because sometimes the system can be contradictory. There also are difficulties around scaling and natural difficulties around your level of skill in terms of your domestic labor, hence the importance of education there again. And I think if Marcel was here, one of our third speaker, she would point to the importance of sort of civil corporate government collaboration in a democratic context, because we want economic growth not to the detriment of political freedoms and human rights. We don't want to import the Chinese model entirely. We want the good parts of it in a sort of pragmatic sense. So really, I think it depends on the country, though I think certainly there are some parts of the Chinese model which can be adapted. Thanks.
Awesome, thanks. So we're coming to an end. I guess I'll raise one last thing and offer an opportunity for comments from the audience in the chat or from our panelists, which is that, a part of thinking about new economic sort of futures and the role of the state and a challenge to the existing economic orthodoxies means thinking about a shift in power, right? And a challenge to that. And Crystal's already sort of alluded to this, right? The sort of spaces in which you're involved in which you're starting to see new constellations of actors engaging with each other. But the sort of challenge which I think we face is obviously accelerating those domestically, but also the fact that we face not just institutional barriers, the IMF and so on, but of course, based on the way in which those entities, both internationally and locally, hold and exercise enormous power, right? And so any sort of last reflections from either of you in the sort of building of power as a counterweight towards that, or any last reflections on steps we must take to rewrite the script which we have now. If in the interim I can just draw people's attention to the chat where you've been asked to provide us feedback if you're able to. Bhaso, just you've got like 2 minutes tops, and then Crystal to you, and any other closing thoughts you might want to offer.
Thank you very much, Gilad, and thank you as well to your colleagues for inviting us and putting together this panel. And thank you very much to Crystal for sharing her views and her findings with us. I've just come out of a conference that we put together as the department, and the theme of that, it was a two-day conference, and the theme of this was around, well, the basic framing of it was participatory democracy, good governance, and social justice. And I'm just amazed because we had 60 speakers from all over the continent, and I'm just amazed by the incredible work that all these civil society actors have been able to do, sometimes directly against their governments, sometimes in spite of their governments. Many of them are closing gaps which should be where the state should be visible in a number of areas, including recently with COVID, including in conflict situations and in post-conflict situations of rebuilding. And I think the sentiment here was one of the core sentiments and takeaways for me is around the notion of vigilance, right? That there are some fundamental structural long-term problems that need to be fixed and need to be worked on with a long-term orientation, and at the same time there are arising new challenges. The rise of the authoritarian digital state is being one of the core challenges, that emerging challenges that we are seeing. So I think it really comes down to wielding the tools at our disposal. I think there are a lot of good actors, on the other hand, with incredible technological sophistication. So in a way, things have never been harder. Well, I'm sure they have, but there are sort of there's been a bit of a regression in a number of areas where we thought inevitable gains and sort of permanent gains had been made. But at the same time, things have never been more enabling in terms of the technologies that we wield. So I think if those can be made use of, if networks, because part of globalization of technological saturation is that also we're able to minimize the incredible cost of mobilization across spaces. So I think there's never been a great opportunity for mobilization. The barriers to entry are certainly lower, and at the same time, there's incredible levels of exhaustion among people that needs to be taken note of and turned into energy for change. So I think that's my takeaway, and thank you very much once again for the kind invitation.
Awesome, thank you, and for weaving so many threads from your own work right up to where we are now. There's been so many interesting threads. Crystal, over to you.
Thanks, Gilad, and thanks to the REFA Festival. This has been really great, and I'm really grateful to have shared space and learned from Bhaso. I'm now following you on Twitter. Sorry. So I guess this is where connections are made, right? And that's part of the work that we have to do And Bhaso, I'm tired, I'm exhausted by all the work that we do that is so thankless and so hard all the time. And it just feels like two steps forward and 10 steps back, and you're constantly being hit. But I take solace in knowing that there's been people before us that have done the work. And I was reading a book by Dawn, Developmental Alternatives for Women in a New Era, from 1985. I won't say how old I was or not was, but they could have been writing about 2021. And all these things that I see and that I analyze and write about and create narratives about have been written before. And it's important to acknowledge the wisdom on whose shoulders that we stand, I think. But for me, my micro actions are in the narratives. I try these days as much as possible to quote African scholars, African thinkers, decolonize what knowledge is. It doesn't have to be written, it can be spoken, it can be recorded conversations such as this, and acknowledging that that is as valid a piece of knowledge as the next journal or book, I think is important to recognize. But also the work that we do is complex. Life happens in complexity all at the same time. I don't wake up and live SDG 1 today and live SDG 2 tomorrow, right? And so our response must also remember, acknowledge, be cognizant that all these intersecting issues all come together and form life. And we don't have the luxury of working in silos anymore. We can't just think of access to water and not think of, land title for women. Everything is connected, all oppression is interwoven and linked. And that is at the heart of what I'm trying so desperately to hold on to and remember as we work. But also, we need to retell and reclaim our own stories for ourselves and be the ones to tell this narrative. We need to put an end to being, data collectors and case studies. Public services and goods, many of the case studies are written up in the global north and we're used as, case studies of how this theory manifests. And it's about time we put a stop to that. Can we do our own analysis in our own voices, make sure that we have an inclusion of very diverse voices telling these narratives? And really, I think lastly, the most important piece of work, which I find very, very hard, is reimagining. I find it very hard to imagine a Nairobi where I live, where access to healthcare, dignified quality healthcare that's universally accessible is a thing that is a reality. We spend a lot of time analyzing the problem, and which must always be done, but the work of reimagining and the work of offering solid, rigorous, workable alternatives, I think is something that we must put a lot more attention on. What does a budget look like that is healthy, that is dignifiable, that is well-being, that is meaningful for citizens? What does a tax policy look like that is equitable, that is fair, that is just? What does it actually look like beyond the sometimes fluffiness of rights conversations? I think that work of reimagining is very important, and it calls for us, I said this before, to let go of the shackles that hold us to this idea that this is the only way we can run an economy or engage in an economy. And I think we have to be brave enough, audacious enough to really reimagine everything and maybe burn it all down and start afresh, which is slightly problematic for some people, but I would really like to take a match to the World Bank or these big institutions. I hope this is not, it's still recording. You can delete that. But yeah, that's how tired I am. I'll stop there, Gilad.
No, thanks, Crystal, for those closing words. And I think in the context of this festival, really fitting, because what they speak to is the connection and intersection of forms of knowledge production, creation, what we value, and forms of kind of sort of either policy or other action, right? And how those two are connected, right? How the forms of knowledge, like creation are intimately linked to our ability to create alternative futures. And in the small sphere of economics, that's precisely what the REFA Festival is all about. So a fitting in there, and it's just left to me to thank both panelists and those that are in attendance, as well as the organizers here, and to wish everyone a good evening and a replenishing weekend when that finally comes. Crystal, enjoy your hotel stay, and thanks very much to everybody.
Thank you so much. Well done. Congratulations.
Bye. Thank
Thank
you.